On a sticky Tuesday morning in late June, the kind where the air feels thick enough to chew, a woman named Maya Carter eased her silver sedan onto the on-ramp of Interstate 20, just outside Jackson. She'd been up since before sunrise, again, reviewing case files, cross-checking witness statements, and drafting a motion that needed to land on a federal judge's desk by noon. Her coffee, now lukewarm, sat in the cup holder, untouched since the first sip. She wasn't rushing, not exactly, but there was a quiet urgency in the way she kept her eyes on the road, her fingers tapping once against the wheel at every red light, as if counting down the seconds until she could get back to work. She wasn't flashy. Her clothes were neat but unremarkable. A navy blazer over a white blouse, black slacks, low heels she could walk in for hours. No jewelry except for a simple silver watch her grandmother had given her years ago. She didn't wear her authority like a badge on her chest. If anything, she tried to disappear into the background, especially in places where people made snap judgments before even hearing a full sentence. She'd learned long ago that blending in was sometimes the best form of armor. The sun glared off the hoods of passing trucks as she merged into the right lane, signaling clearly before doing so. She checked her mirrors, adjusted her speed, and settled into the rhythm of morning traffic. Everything was routine until it wasn't. 2 blocks past the city limits, blue lights flashed behind her. Not the quick blink of a passing cruiser, but the deliberate pulsing strobe of a vehicle pulling her over. She exhaled slowly, signaled again, and guided her car onto the narrow shoulder. Gravel crunched under her tires. She turned off the engine, rolled down her window halfway, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. It was a habit, not paranoia. Just something she'd been taught early. Make yourself small, make yourself safe. Make yourself predictable. The officer who approached was tall, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. He didn't say good morning, didn't ask how she was doing. Just stood there for a beat too long, hand resting near his belt before finally asking for her license and registration. She handed them over without comment, keeping her voice calm, her movements slow. "Is everything okay, officer?" "You failed to signal your lane change back at the overpass," he said, not looking at her, scanning the documents instead. "I did signal," she replied gently. "I always do." He grunted as if her words were irrelevant. Then he turned and walked back to his cruiser without another word. She watched him in the side mirror. He radioed in her plates. She knew what came next, the routine check, the waiting game. But something felt off. The way he'd looked at her car, then at her, like she didn't belong behind the wheel of a vehicle that clean, in clothes that pressed. She'd seen that look before, in elevators, in grocery store lines, in court hallways when she wasn't wearing her DOJ lanyard. Minutes passed. The second officer arrived in another patrol car, parking at an angle behind hers, blocking her in. He stepped out, younger but with the same stiff posture, the same unreadable sunglasses. They conferred near the trunk of the first cruiser, heads close together. Then both walked back toward her. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer said. "Am I being detained?" she asked. "Yes." "On what grounds?" "Failure to comply with a lawful order," he said. Though she hadn't refused anything yet, she took a breath. "I'm going to step out slowly with my hands visible." She did exactly that. As soon as her feet touched the pavement, the second officer moved in, patting her down with rough, impersonal motions. She didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. "I'm a federal attorney," she said quietly. "I'd appreciate being treated with basic respect." That seemed to amuse them. One of them chuckled. "Sure you are, they didn't cuff her right away." Instead, they asked why she was driving through this part of town, where she worked. Who she knew. She answered each question plainly, without attitude, but they kept pressing, their tone sharpening. When she asked to record the interaction, the first officer snatched her phone from her hand and placed it in his pocket. "Evidence," he muttered. Then came the moment that changed everything. She asked again why she was being detained. The first officer leaned in, his voice low but edged with something like contempt. "Because you talk too much. Because you think you're smarter than us. Because you didn't just shut up and take the ticket like you were supposed to." That's when she knew this wasn't about a lane change. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Just stood there, eyes forward, as they finally snapped the cuffs on, tighter than necessary, and walked her to the back of the second cruiser. The metal seat was hot through her slacks. The door slammed shut with a hollow thud. Outside, traffic kept moving. No one slowed down. No one looked twice. At the precinct, the booking process was humiliating but efficient. They took her fingerprints, her photo, her belt, her watch. They logged her belongings into a plastic bin and shoved it onto a shelf without labeling it properly. She asked for a phone call. They told her she'd get one when they got around to it. Hours passed. No lawyer, no explanation. Just a hard bench in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and sweat. She sat with her back straight, eyes open, mind racing. Not with fear, but with calculation. She could call her office. She could have someone from the U.S. Attorney's office down here in an hour, flashing credentials, demanding her release. But that would blow her cover. And right now, her cover was the only thing giving her a clear view of how the system really worked when no one was watching. So she waited. Finally, late in the afternoon, they brought her before a duty magistrate for arraignment. 2 charges: obstructing a law enforcement officer and resisting arrest. Both flimsy, both common catch-alls when an officer feels challenged. She stood silently as the charges were read. When asked how she pleaded, she said, "Not guilty," in a voice so steady it surprised even her. Bail was set at $1,000, low enough to seem reasonable, high enough to trap someone without resources. She posted it with cash from her emergency wallet, retrieved her belongings minus her phone, which they claimed was still being processed, and walked out into the humid dusk, alone. Back at her apartment, she showered for a long time, scrubbing until her skin felt raw. She made tea, not coffee, too late for caffeine, and sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Her body ached from the cuffs. Her pride stung more than her wrists, but beneath the exhaustion was something else: resolve. She knew what she had to do. She could file a complaint. She could go to internal affairs, but those paths rarely led anywhere, especially when the officers involved had clean records and the right connections. No, what she needed was a stage, a moment where the imbalance of power couldn't be ignored, and she knew exactly where to find it. County Courtroom 3. Judge Harold Brinkley, known for his short fuse, his loyalty to local law enforcement, and his habit of dismissing civil rights claims with a wave of his hand. He'd been on the bench for 23 years. He'd never once ruled against a police officer in a use of force case, and next week he'd be presiding over her arraignment. She smiled faintly into her teacup. Let him think. She was just another nobody. Let him talk down to her. Let him show the world exactly who he was while she stood there, quiet, watching, waiting for the right second to speak. Because when that moment came, it wouldn't just be about a traffic stop. It would be about every person who'd ever been made to feel small in that courtroom. Every person who'd been told to shut up and take it. Every person who'd walked out with their dignity bruised, but their truth intact. She wasn't just defending herself, she was setting a trap, with patience as her bait and justice as her goal, and she'd already decided she wouldn't spring it until the whole room was watching. The courtroom smelled like old wood and stale coffee, the kind of place where time moved slower than it did outside. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow on the scuffed linoleum floor and the rows of hard wooden benches. A ceiling fan spun lazily in the corner, doing little to cut through the thick summer heat that seeped in through the cracked windows. It was the kind of room where people came not for justice, but because they had no other choice. Maya arrived early, just after 8. She wore the same navy blazer from the day of the traffic stop, cleaned, pressed, but still carrying the memory of handcuffs and gravel. She carried a slim leather folder under her arm and a reusable water bottle in her hand. No entourage, no lawyer, just her standing alone near the defense table, scanning the room with quiet focus. A few people trickled in, mostly regulars, public defenders shuffling files, bailiffs sipping from paper cups, clerks tapping at keyboards like the world depended on their spreadsheets. One reporter from the local paper sat near the back, chewing gum and scribbling notes in a spiral notebook. He glanced up when Maya walked in, then looked away just as quickly. To him, she was probably just another defendant, another face in a system that chewed through people like kindling. She didn't mind being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. At precisely 8:45 a.m., a side door creaked open and Judge Harold Brinkley entered. He was in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair combed neatly over a pink scalp. Wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose, and a gavel tucked under one arm like a walking stick. He moved with the slow confidence of someone who'd never been questioned, ever. His robe was crisp, his shoes polished, his expression already set in a permanent frown of mild irritation. He took his seat without ceremony. "Call the next case," he said, not looking up from his docket. "People versus Carter," the clerk announced. Maya stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm representing myself." Brinkley finally looked up. His eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to place her. Then his gaze flicked to the two officers seated at the prosecution table, both in full uniform, both sitting straighter the moment the judge's attention landed on them. "All right," Brinkley said, voice dry. "Let's get this over with." "Officers, you may proceed," one of them stood. "Your Honor, on June 24th, we initiated a routine traffic stop after observing the defendant fail to signal a lane change on Interstate 20. Upon interaction, she became argumentative, refused to comply with lawful orders, and physically resisted when we attempted to place her under arrest." Maya raised her hand slightly. "Objection, Your Honor, that's not accurate." Brinkley turned to her, eyebrows lifting in mock surprise. "Oh? And you're a lawyer, are you?" "I'm familiar with the law, yes," she said evenly. He snorted. "Familiar doesn't mean qualified. Sit down and let the professionals speak." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The reporter stopped chewing his gum. The officer continued, painting a picture of a defiant, uncooperative woman who'd escalated a simple stop into a confrontation. He mentioned her tone, her body language, how she kept asking questions like she knew better than we did. He never mentioned that she'd kept her hands visible. Never mentioned that she'd asked for clarification, not defiance. Never mentioned that she'd offered no physical resistance at all. When he finished, Brinkley nodded. "Seems straightforward. Anything else from the prosecution?" "No, Your Honor. Defense?" Brinkley said, turning to Maya with a look that said he'd already made up his mind. She stood again, calm but firm. "Yes, Your Honor. First, I'd like to request access to the dash cam and body cam footage from the stop. It directly contradicts the officer's account." Brinkley waved a hand. Motion denied. "That footage is under internal review. Not admissible here. But it's my right to review evidence that could exonerate me," she said. "You're right." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "This isn't federal court, sweetheart. This is county court. And in my courtroom, we don't entertain fishing expeditions from defendants who think they can play lawyer." The word "sweetheart" hung in the air like smoke. Someone in the back coughed. Maya didn't flinch. "I'm not playing, Your Honor. I'm asking for due process." "Due process?" He leaned forward, voice dropping to a condescending whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You want due process? Then you should have cooperated when the officers told you to. Instead, you decided to lecture them like you were their supervisor. That's not how it works." She took a slow breath. "With respect, Your Honor, asking questions isn't resisting. Requesting to record the interaction isn't obstruction. And being polite doesn't make someone guilty." Brinkley's face tightened. "Are you accusing these officers of lying?" "I'm saying the truth is on video," she replied. One of the officers shifted in his seat. The other stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Brinkley sighed as if burdened by her very presence. "Look, I've known these officers for years. They're good men. They don't go looking for trouble. If they say you resisted, then you resisted. End of story?" Maya felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, not anger, but something sharper. Clarity. This wasn't about facts. It never had been. It was about who the system trusted by default, and who it assumed was guilty until proven otherwise. Still, she pressed on. "Your Honor, I'd also like to cite precedent. In State v. Delgado, the court ruled that verbal disagreement alone does not constitute obstruction." "Save the law school lecture for someone who cares," Brinkley interrupted, louder this time. "I didn't go to some fancy university to be schooled by a woman who couldn't even signal a lane change." A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. The reporter scribbled faster. Maya's voice stayed level, but her eyes held his. "I signaled, Your Honor. The video will show that." "The video," he repeated, rolling his eyes, "which doesn't exist for our purposes today. Next." She didn't sit. "Not yet." "Then I moved to dismiss the charges based on lack of probable cause." Brinkley actually laughed. "Denied. And if you keep wasting my time, I'll hold you in contempt." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Maya's face. Not fear, but disappointment. Not in the judge, but in the room itself, in the silence of the people watching, in the way justice could wear a robe and still look away. Outside, a small group had gathered on the courthouse steps, maybe a dozen people, holding signs that read, "Know your rights and who protects us from the protectors." They didn't know who she was. They just knew another black woman had been arrested after a traffic stop, and that felt familiar enough to bring them out in the heat. Back inside, Brinkley shuffled his papers. "All right. Based on the credible testimony of sworn officers and the defendant's clear pattern of noncompliance, I find probable cause for both charges. Case proceeds to trial. Bail remains as set." He was about to bang his gavel when Maya spoke again, softly, but with a weight that made everyone stop. "Your Honor, before you close this hearing, may I have one final word?" Brinkley paused, gavel hovering midair. He looked annoyed but curious. "Make it quick." She reached into her folder. Not for notes, not for legal citations, but for something else. The room went still. Even the fan seemed to slow, because what she pulled out wasn't a piece of paper, it was a badge, not a local one. Not a city ID, but a laminated federal credential, stamped with the seal of the United States Department of Justice. She placed it gently on the defense table, facing the bench. "I'm not just a defendant today," she said, voice clear and calm. "I'm an assistant United States attorney for the Eastern District, and I was pulled over, detained, and charged without cause, while doing nothing more than driving home from work." Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind that feels like the air has been sucked out of the room. Brinkley stared at the badge like it might bite him. His mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at the bailiff, who looked just as stunned. One of the officers turned pale. The other dropped his pen. The reporter in the back stopped writing. His pen hovered over the page, ink bleeding into the paper. Maya didn't smile. Didn't gloat. She just stood there, hands at her sides, letting the truth settle like dust after a storm. Because the real story wasn't about her title. It was about what happened when the system thought no one was watching. And now, suddenly everyone was. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the kind of stillness that comes right before thunder cracks open the sky. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hesitate mid-turn, as if it too understood the weight of what had just happened. Judge Brinkley stared at the badge on the defense table like it was a live wire. His fingers, which had been tapping impatiently on the bench just moments before, now lay flat and stiff, as though afraid to twitch. He blinked once, twice, then slowly pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose as if adjusting his vision might make the federal seal disappear. You're joking," he finally said, voice cracking slightly. Maya didn't answer right away. She just stood there, calm, grounded, her expression unreadable but her posture saying everything. "This is real, and you've been caught." From the back of the courtroom, a man in a dark suit stood up. He hadn't spoken all morning, hadn't drawn attention to himself, just sat near the rear door like any other observer. But now his presence carried weight. "Your Honor," he said, voice low but firm, "I can confirm that Ms. Carter is indeed an assistant United States attorney. I'm with the U.S. Marshal Service Liaison Office. We've been aware of her situation since her arrest." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The reporter dropped his notebook onto his lap and fumbled for his phone, thumb hovering over the camera app, but then stopped himself, remembering courtroom rules. He settled for scribbling furiously instead. One of the officers shifted in his seat so hard his chair squeaked. His partner kept his eyes locked straight ahead, face flushed, knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Brinkley swallowed. This changes nothing," he said, but the words came out thin, unconvincing. "The charges stand. The facts of the stop remain, do they?" Maya asked, still quiet, still steady. "Because if the facts were truly clear, you wouldn't have refused to look at the footage. You wouldn't have dismissed my motions without hearing them. And you certainly wouldn't have called me sweetheart while doing it." The judge's face tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. For the first time in decades, he had no gavel-swinging comeback. No rehearsed line about courtroom decorum or respect for the bench, because the truth was sitting right in front of him, wearing a navy blazer and speaking in a voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. The bailiff, an older man with tired eyes and a wedding ring worn smooth from years of use, cleared his throat. Your Honor, maybe we should recess for a moment. Brinkley nodded stiffly. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. He didn't bang his gavel. Just stood, robe rustling, and walked quickly through the side door without looking back. As soon as the door clicked shut, the room erupted, not in shouting, but in hushed, urgent whispers. People leaned toward each other, eyes wide, voices low. Did you see that? She's federal? He called her sweetheart like she was nobody. The reporter stood and walked toward Maya, notebook in hand, but stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure. Maya didn't acknowledge him. She simply picked up her badge, slipped it back into her folder, and turned to the window. Outside, the small group on the courthouse steps had grown. Someone had brought a megaphone. A woman's voice floated through the glass. If it can happen to her, it can happen to any of us. Inside, the two officers stood to leave, but the bailiff gently blocked their path. You might want to wait, he said, not unkindly. Things are complicated now. One of them muttered something under his breath. The other just stared at the floor. 15 minutes stretched into 20. Then 25. People checked their watches. The fan resumed its lazy spin. The air grew heavier. When Brinkley finally returned, he looked older. The color had drained from his cheeks. His robe hung slightly crooked, as if he'd thrown it back on in a hurry. He sat without ceremony, avoided eye contact with everyone, and cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, he began, voice strained. In light of new information, I am granting your motion for judicial recusal. A few gasps. Even the bailiff looked surprised. I will also, Brinkley continued, gripping the edge of the bench like it might steady him, recommend that the charges be reviewed by the district attorney's office for potential dismissal. And I am ordering the immediate release of all body cam and dash cam footage related to your stop to your legal counsel. Maya nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor, but she didn't sit. Not yet. Before we adjourn, she said, I'd like to make one thing clear. I didn't reveal my position to gain special treatment. I did it because this courtroom, this system failed someone today. And that someone could have been anyone. A teacher, a nurse, a student, a mother driving home from work. The only difference is that I have a badge that makes people listen. But that shouldn't matter. The truth should be enough, she paused, letting that sink in. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for accountability, for transparency, for the kind of fairness that doesn't depend on who you are but on what's right. No one spoke. Even the judge looked down at his hands. Then, from the back row, someone started clapping. Just one person at first, a young man in a faded t-shirt who'd been sitting quietly the whole time. Then another joined in. Then another. Soon the entire gallery was applauding, not loudly but steadily, like a heartbeat returning to a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Brinkley didn't react. He just stared at the docket in front of him, as if the pages might offer him an escape. Court is adjourned, he said quietly. And this time he did bang the gavel, once softly, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he never meant to write. People began to file out, but slowly, as if reluctant to leave the moment behind. The reporter approached Maya again, this time with more respect. Can I get a quote? He asked. She shook her head. Not today, but tell the truth. That's enough. Outside, the crowd parted as she stepped onto the courthouse steps. The sun was high now, hot and bright, but the air felt different, lighter somehow. A woman in a yellow dress stepped forward, eyes glistening. Thank you, she said simply. Maya touched her arm gently. No, thank you for being here. She didn't give a speech. Didn't pose for photos, just walked down the steps past the cameras that were now arriving in a flurry, and headed toward her car. But before she reached it, she stopped, turned, and looked back at the courthouse, one of those old stone buildings that was supposed to stand for justice, but too often stood for power. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, because revealing her identity wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Within hours, her office would file a formal request for a Department of Justice civil rights review into the traffic stop. She'd also submit a complaint to the State Judicial Conduct Board about Brinkley's behavior, the dismissive tone, the gendered language, the refusal to consider evidence based on who presented it. And quietly, through back channels, she'd reach out to the local NAACP and a community legal aid group, offering support to others who'd faced similar treatment but didn't have a federal badge to flash. But none of that would happen in front of cameras. None of it would be dramatic. It would be slow, meticulous, and deeply human, built on phone calls, paperwork, late-night strategy sessions, and the kind of persistence that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. Back in her car, she finally allowed herself to exhale. Her hands trembled slightly on the wheel, not from fear, but from the sheer emotional weight of what she'd just done. She hadn't set out to humiliate anyone. She'd set out to expose a pattern. And today, in that overheated courtroom, the pattern had shown its face. As she pulled away from the curb, a news van sped past, heading toward the courthouse. She didn't look back, because real change doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens in the quiet moments afterward, when people start asking harder questions, when officers think twice before reaching for cuffs, when judges remember that their gavel doesn't make them infallible. And sometimes it starts with one woman in a navy blazer, standing alone in a room full of people who thought they knew exactly who she was, until she reminded them that dignity doesn't wear a uniform. It just shows up day after day and refuses to be ignored. The days that followed didn't unfold like a movie. There were no dramatic press conferences, no shouting matches in hallways, no sudden resignations splashed across the evening news. Instead, change moved the way it often does in real life, quietly, deliberately, like water carving a path through stone over time. But for those paying attention, the ground had shifted. Within 24 hours of the courtroom revelation, a formal letter arrived at the county sheriff's office. It came from the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, requesting full access to all body cam footage, radio logs, and internal reports related to the traffic stop. The tone was professional but firm, and it carried weight. Federal inquiries weren't something local departments could brush off with a shrug and a, "we'll look into it." The two officers involved were placed on administrative leave, not as punishment, but as standard procedure during an active review. They turned in their badges and service weapons without protest, though one of them lingered in the parking lot afterward, staring at his cruiser like he wasn't sure how to exist outside of it. Their union issued a brief statement saying they fully cooperated and trusted the process. But behind closed doors, conversations grew tense. Because everyone knew, this wasn't just about one stop anymore. It was about every stop that had come before it. Meanwhile, Judge Brinkley didn't return to the bench the next day, or the day after. Court clerks told reporters he was dealing with a personal matter, but courthouse regulars knew better. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd checked into a hotel. Others claimed he'd been seen meeting with a lawyer who specialized in judicial ethics cases. What was certain was that his name had been quietly added to a closed-door agenda at the State Judicial Conduct Commission. And once your name lands there, it rarely comes off clean. But the real story wasn't happening in offices or hearing rooms. It was unfolding in living rooms, barbershops, church basements, and community centers across the city. Because for the first time in a long time, people felt seen. A local high school teacher printed out copies of the courtroom transcript, what little had been released, and passed them around at a parent-teacher meeting. "This," she told the room, "is why we teach our kids their rights. Not because we expect trouble, but because the system doesn't always assume they're innocent." A retired bus driver started a petition calling for mandatory de-escalation training for all county law enforcement. It gathered over 2,000 signatures in 3 days. And then there were the calls. They started trickling into legal aid hotlines, civil rights nonprofits, even the public defender's office. People who'd been through similar stops, similar dismissals, similar silences. Some had been afraid to speak up before. But now, hearing that even a federal prosecutor could be treated like a suspect just for asking questions, it gave them courage. One woman described being pulled over for driving while black and held for hours without explanation. A college student talked about being searched without cause after buying groceries. None of their stories made national news, but together they formed a pattern too large to ignore. Maya didn't seek any of this attention. In fact, she avoided it. She turned down every interview request, national networks, podcasts, even a documentary crew that showed up at her office with flowers and a handwritten note. She didn't post about it on social media, didn't give speeches. But she did something far more powerful. She listened. Late one Thursday evening, she sat in a folding chair at a community center on the east side of town. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. About 30 people had gathered, not for a rally but for a listening session organized by a local advocacy group. Maya hadn't announced she'd be there. She just showed up, sat in the back, and let others speak. One by one, people shared their stories, not with anger but with a quiet exhaustion that ran deeper than words. A mother talked about teaching her teenage son how to keep his hands visible during traffic stops. A veteran described being followed through a department store despite wearing his service cap. An elderly man recalled being questioned for loitering while waiting for the bus outside his own apartment building. When it was Maya's turn, she didn't talk about her credentials. Didn't mention the courtroom. She just said, "I've been where you are, and I know how lonely it feels when no one believes you." Then she leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and asked, "What do you need?" That simple question, "What do you need?" became the seed of something new. Over the next few weeks, she began working quietly with local legal aid attorneys to create a Know Your Rights toolkit. Simple, plain language guides explaining what to do during a traffic stop, how to file a complaint, when to ask for a lawyer. They printed them in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese and distributed them through churches, libraries, and even barbershops. No logos, no fanfare, just information, handed out like bread to the hungry. She also started showing up at county court hearings, not as a prosecutor, but as a citizen. She'd sit in the back row, notebook in hand, watching how judges spoke to defendants, how officers testified, how bail was set for people who couldn't afford it. Sometimes she'd stay after and talk to public defenders, asking what resources they lacked. Other times she'd just listen and take notes. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. Judges began double-checking their rulings. Officers testified with more precision. Even the bailiffs started treating defendants with a little more courtesy. Not because they feared her, but because she reminded them that someone was paying attention. Back at her federal office, her colleagues handled the official channels. The DOJ launched a broader review, not just of the two officers, but of the entire traffic stop protocol in that county. Preliminary findings showed a troubling pattern. Black drivers were 3 times more likely to be searched during routine stops than white drivers, despite lower contraband discovery rates. The data had been there for years. No one had bothered to connect the dots until now. The local district attorney, sensing the tide turning, moved to dismiss the charges against Maya in the interest of justice. The motion was filed quietly without press release or ceremony. But it sent a message. Even local power structures were recalibrating. Still, Maya knew better than to call it victory. Real justice wasn't a single courtroom moment. It was infrastructure. It was policy. It was the slow, unglamorous work of changing systems so they didn't keep producing the same harm. One afternoon, she met with the head of the state judicial college, the body responsible for training judges. They sat in a sunlit conference room with paper cups of tea and a stack of training manuals between them. "We've always included a module on bias," the director said, flipping through pages. "But it's mostly theoretical. Case studies, hypotheticals." Maya nodded. What if it were real? What if new judges had to hear from people who've been on the receiving end of biased rulings, not as defendants but as teachers? The idea took root. Within a month, a pilot program was approved. Community voices would be invited into judicial training sessions, not to accuse but to inform, to humanize the abstract concept of fairness with real faces, real stories, real pain, and real hope. None of this made headlines. But it mattered, because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it starts with one person refusing to stay silent, then using that moment not for personal vindication, but to build a ladder for others to climb. Maya never asked for a spotlight, but by stepping into one, even briefly, she helped others find their footing in the dark. And that, more than any gavel or badge, was the real work. Months passed, and the city settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that wasn't defined by outrage or headlines, but by quiet adjustments, small reckonings, and the slow rebuilding of trust. The courthouse still stood on its hill, the same stone facade unchanged, but something inside had shifted. You could feel it in the way clerks greeted people by name now, in the way judges paused before speaking, in the way officers made eye contact and said, "Ma'am" or "Sir" without the edge of suspicion. The charges against Maya were formally dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be brought again. The paperwork arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into her office mailbox like any other routine notice. She read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a manila folder labeled closed. No celebration, no sigh of relief. Just closure. The two officers never returned to active duty. One resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. The other transferred to a records division in a neighboring county, out of uniform, out of sight. Their names faded from public conversation, not because they were erased, but because the story had grown bigger than them. Judge Brinkley announced his retirement 3 weeks after the courtroom incident. His statement was brief, thanking the community for years of service and expressing hope for the next generation of jurists. He didn't mention Maya, didn't apologize. But he didn't fight the ethics review either. He simply stepped away, like a man who finally understood that some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. But the real legacy wasn't in who left. It was in what stayed. Across the state, a new judicial training module rolled out, co-developed by federal prosecutors, civil rights advocates, and community members. It wasn't about shaming judges. It was about showing them faces, real people who'd sat in their courtrooms feeling invisible, unheard, or presumed guilty before a word was spoken. One exercise asked new judges to listen to audio recordings of arraignments, not to evaluate legal procedure, but to notice tone, word choice, who got interrupted, who got believed. It was uncomfortable. It was necessary. And for the first time, it was required. In the county sheriff's office, body cam footage from routine stops was now automatically reviewed if a complaint was filed, not by internal affairs alone, but by an independent civilian oversight panel. The policy change came quietly, buried in a budget meeting, but its impact was immediate. Officers began documenting stops more thoroughly. Supervisors started asking harder questions, and the number of resisting arrest charges for nonviolent traffic stops dropped by nearly 40% in 6 months. None of this happened because of a single hero. It happened because one moment, raw, unexpected, and deeply human, cracked open a space where change could grow. Maya returned to her work at the U.S. Attorney's Office, handling complex fraud cases and public corruption investigations, the kind of work that rarely makes the evening news but keeps institutions honest. She wore her navy blazer less often now, not because she'd changed, but because she no longer needed armor in the same way. Still, she kept it in her closet, pressed and ready, just in case. But she didn't disappear from the local courts. Every few weeks, she'd show up at County Courtroom 3, not as a lawyer, not as a federal official, but as a citizen. She'd sit in the back row, hands folded, watching. Sometimes she'd stay for an entire docket. Other times, just one case. She never spoke unless asked. But her presence was felt. Judges straightened their notes when they saw her. Public defenders nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Even defendants seemed to sit a little taller, as if reminded that someone in the room saw them as more than a file number. Once a young woman, barely 20, charged with shoplifting a bottle of baby formula, broke down in tears during her hearing. The judge, a new appointee who'd gone through the updated bias training, paused the proceedings. "Take your time," he said gently. "You're not alone here." Maya watched from the back, eyes glistening, and thought, this is what it's about. She also kept her promise to the community. The Know Your Rights guides were now in over 50 locations, libraries, health clinics, even laundromats. Volunteers handed them out at bus stops and farmers markets. A local artist turned key points into illustrated posters that hung in high school hallways. The language was simple. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to ask if you're free to go. You don't have to consent to a search. No legalese, just clarity, and people used them. A teenager pulled over for a broken taillight calmly recited his rights from memory. The officer, surprised but respectful, issued a warning and let him go. A grandmother asked to see a supervisor when questioned for suspicious behavior in a grocery store, and the manager apologized on the spot. These weren't viral moments. They were private victories, but they added up. One Saturday morning, Maya stood in line at a coffee shop near the courthouse. She wasn't in a rush, just wanted a quiet cup before heading to a community meeting. The barista, a young woman with braids and a nose ring, handed her the cup and said, "You're her, aren't you?" Maya smiled faintly. "I'm just someone who likes coffee." The barista leaned in, voice low. My cousin was pulled over last month. He remembered your story. Stayed calm, asked for the camera. They let him go in 10 minutes. She paused. Thank you for making it so he didn't have to be brave alone. Maya didn't know what to say, so she just touched the woman's hand and whispered, Tell him I said he was brave. That was the thing no one talked about enough. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act anyway, especially when you've been told your voice doesn't matter. As the year turned, the city began to heal, not with grand gestures, but with daily acts of dignity. A police chief invited community leaders to co-design a new de-escalation protocol. A local law school launched a fellowship for students from underrepresented backgrounds interested in public defense. Even the courthouse installed a water fountain near the defendant's entrance, small but symbolic, because everyone deserves basic comfort, even when they're at their lowest. Maya never sought credit. In fact, she discouraged it. When a local paper tried to run a feature calling her the woman who changed the system, she declined. I didn't change anything, she told the reporter over the phone. I just held up a mirror. The change came from everyone who looked into it and decided to do better. And that was true, because real justice isn't delivered from on high. It's built from the ground up, by teachers who explain rights to their students, by neighbors who speak up when something feels wrong, by judges who choose humility over authority, by officers who remember they serve the public, not control it. One evening, as autumn settled into the air, Maya walked past the courthouse after dark. The lights were off, the steps empty, but a single candle sat near the base of the flagpole, left there by someone who didn't leave a name. She stopped, looked at it flickering in the breeze, and thought about all the people who'd come before her, who'd been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. She thought about the ones still fighting, and she thought about the ones who'd never see their names in print but kept showing up anyway. She didn't blow out the candle. She just stood there for a moment, letting its light remind her why the work never really ends. Because justice isn't a destination. It's a practice, a choice, a daily commitment to see people as they are, not as the system assumes they should be. And sometimes, it arrives not with a gavel, not with a badge, but with a quiet voice in a hot courtroom, asking for one final word. That word wasn't guilty or innocent, it was enough silence. Enough assumptions, enough turning away. And in that moment, everything changed. Not because one person won, but because many people finally saw what had been there all along. The truth, waiting to be honored.